Hello and welcome again to What If Natives Won, a video blog and channel about alternate history and American Indians, Native Americans, indigenous peoples. This is the fourth video of about 24 planned ones, and part 3 of 3. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I teach American, American Indian, and Latin American history. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story anthology, What If Natives Won? That is what this video blog and channel are about. There's a huge lack of alternate history written about American Indians, indigenous people. Many people don't like to think about genocides in America. They are in denial. They likely were never taught about these genocides. Many of them don't want to be reminded about it, or they want to believe these genocides never happened, or that it was all, or mostly, an accident. That is what this video blog and channel will be all about. I've had great success using alternate history to teach my students, show them that absolutely nothing in history was inevitable. It never had to be. The worst of human history is always a conscious choice. How things turn out is based on how evil the evil choose to be, and how well and how strong that good people choose to stand up to them or stop them. The way things turned out in world history took a very specific set of circumstances. Sometimes history can turn on very small things. Change even one and you have an entirely different history, different present, different society. Today we talk again about what if others colonize the Americas? If almost literally anyone else colonizes and invades instead of those Europeans who did, native people in the world are far better off. It may be hard to hear this, but we live right now in a dystopian world, one of the worst of all possible outcomes for anyone who is not white. America is today 98% non-native. At least 75 million to 112 million natives were killed by not one genocide, but a series of genocides. There were many genocides, the last of them ending only in the year 2000. There were genocides against natives in not just America, but also Brazil, Canada, Guatemala, Argentina, Mexico, and elsewhere. On top of that is massive genocide denial. This is not taught in almost all American schools and many universities. What is often taught about natives is false, and there are racist images everywhere that are often not admitted to be racist. But all of this could change if others come to the Americas. This video will look at two possibilities. What if the colonization and invasion had been by the Mali Empire of West Africa or a Chinese empire? I have to start this off with a disclaimer. There are crackpot racist groups out there claiming blacks are the supposed true natives. There are black supremacist cults posing as native tribes, the Nuwaubians, Washitas, supposed mound builders, several groups falsely claiming to be Yamasee. These all have a deep hatred of natives and are ashamed and so filled with self-hatred of being African, they deny the slave trade that killed tens of millions of their ancestors. What they frequently do is take genuine evidence of possible African explorers and mix it with obvious falsehoods. None of what I'm presenting agrees with their claims. There is evidence which suggests, but doesn't prove, early African explorers to the Americas. Explorers, not migrations, small numbers, but not entire peoples, and tens of thousands of years after when natives come to the Americas. Directly the opposite of what these black supremacist cults claim. There are Greek and Egyptian history accounts of voyages to the West from Africa in the 13th century before Christ. There are Phoenician coins from the 4th century before Christ that some argue show a map of America. There is the evidence of guanine alloys from Africa, and cocaine was found in ancient Egyptian mummies. The most recent possible account we have is of King Abubakari II of Mali. Mali was an empire for about 400 years, from 1223 to 1645. These were Malinke people. They had an assembly of chiefs. This was a powerful state with great wealth. One of their leaders was Mansa Musa, perhaps the wealthiest man in all history. When he traveled to Mecca with 60,000 men, he gave away 24,000 pounds of gold. The empire had large cities like Timbuktu, which was also a center of Islamic law, and had 100,000 people. Sankore University had over 1 million scripts, manuscripts, writings, and books. Abubakari II possibly voyaged to the Americas in the 1300s. African accounts say his first voyage had 200 ships, The second voyage was said to be 3,000 ships. The boats of the alleged fleet may have resembled these. If either voyage had succeeded and a colony established, the most likely place to land would be the Caribbean. Spanish invaders described Taino accounts of trading with spear tips trading for spear tips with African people. This suggests most Mali ships were lost, the survivors either returning or mixing with local people. A large expedition would have an advantage in conquest: cavalry, and large ships. Their infantry used poisoned arrows. Their imperial army had as many as 100,000 troops. What about disease? We have no evidence of epidemics spread by possible Mali expeditions. Taino accounts taken down by Spaniards describe trade only. Later, when Spaniards brought African slaves to the Caribbean islands, runaway slaves were welcomed by Taino communities. It's also true that early on, Spaniards, English, and French enslaved millions of natives side by side with Africans. There's no evidence that contact with Africans killed natives in large or unusual numbers. It's true that Europeans trying to invade Africa past the coast were often killed by African diseases in large numbers, but they also were often cut off, short of supplies. In other words, they were weakened by starvation. This is exactly what caused large numbers of native deaths by European-spread diseases, except the Europeans did it on purpose, as a tactic of genocide, and against civilians. The Mali Empire started to decline by the 1430s. By the 1560s, their empire was much smaller and weaker. Any colony in the Americas will be cut off, or ended sooner. Their American conquest will end either a few generations before European invasions, or a few generations after. When Columbus invades, he will find a hybrid people, a hybrid culture, and a hybrid state, the Malinke Taino. They will already have suffered any losses from disease and recovered. They will have armed weapons, cavalry, and Mali Empire military tactics. Columbus's early invasion might get wiped out. A successful invasion could be years or decades later, and fight a much harder fight. Notice also how close the Taino were to the best-known major civilizations, the Maya border Taino areas. Mali Empire, steel and horses, and illnesses certainly spread there. The Mayas were in constant trade and contact, and sometimes warfare, with central Mexico's Mexicas, better known as Aztecs. Spanish conquest would take generations longer. Far more Aztecs, Mayas, and Tainos survived. The death toll will be almost entirely from wars, not epidemics. Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean remain over 90% native. When these areas gain independence from Spain, and some of them from France, Britain, or the Dutch, these will be new, not Latino, but native nations. That certainly is native victory. The other possibility to discuss is if China invades and colonizes, or there are Chinese native states. There are several possible, though far from proven, accounts of Chinese explorers in America. Monks named Si and Ho may have come in the 27th century before Christ to the southwest U.S., or what becomes the southwest U.S., Mexico, and Central America. This is according to the Book of Mountain and Seas, the world's oldest geography text. Another monk, Wei Shun, wrote journals describing his voyage in the 5th century before Christ from Alaska to Central America. The third possibility is Admiral Zheng He's fleet. It may have come to South America and the Caribbean. This enormous fleet had hundreds of ships, far larger than Columbus's, carrying tens of thousands of sailors and a cavalry. Here you see one of Zheng He's ships and Columbus's much smaller boats. This was in the 1420s, about 70 years before Columbus. This shows the proven routes Zheng He's fleet took in 7 voyages to the Philippines, India, the Persian Gulf, down the coast of Africa to the southern tip, and all over the Indian Ocean. There are a few who claim Zheng He continued up the west coast of Africa, crossing over to Brazil and the Caribbean. Most scholars argue this is not so, and there's not enough evidence for it. What prevented him or any other potential Chinese conqueror was not outside forces, but what China itself chose. China had been the most powerful nation. China always has been the most powerful nation on the planet for most of human history. It always had a large population. In these times, 150 to 200 million people. It had a powerful military of over 1 million troops, a powerful central state, and some of the best technology. Many Chinese leaders and intellectuals have been inward-looking, thinking they needed nothing outside China, the Middle Kingdom. Zheng He's emperor, though, was Yongle, one of the least isolationist Chinese leaders. Yongle personally led armies fighting what was left of the Mongol Empire. He invaded Vietnam and sent Zheng He to show the world China's power. Under Yongle, China expanded in size and power. It is easy to imagine him arguing for Chinese colonists and military all over the world. After Yongle was another isolationist empire, but after his brief rule was Xuande, another outward-looking emperor. Together the two would have permanently made China into the world's first overseas worldwide empire. So where would the fleets land? Two possibilities. Where a few argue they did land, Brazil and then the Caribbean. The other is if Zheng He follows either route taken by Polynesians when they land in the Americas in multiple migrations and mix with 7 different native peoples from Canada to Chile. The effect would be similar to what I argued in the previous videos about Cordoba, Ottoman, Viking, and Mali invasions. Chinese technology gives them an advantage in conquest. But it is conquest and not genocide as most European invaders did, except perhaps at the end, as I'll discuss later. There is also far less disease, as Linda Newsom's book, Conquest and Pestilence, proves. China was in contact with the Philippines for many centuries and didn't bring massive epidemics. The Spaniards wiped out over 2/3 of Filipinos during their conquest. Chinese invaders didn't practice deliberate starvation tactics. There will also be from 70 to 200 years for native populations to recover. These diseases will already be introduced, but gradually, by the Chinese before Europeans invade, so many native people will already have immunities. What would the Ming Dynasty bring to the Mapuche, the Pacific Northwest, California, or to Taínos, Tupinamba, or Potawatomi people of Brazil? This Han Chinese state believed in a peasant society to have a strong China, and intellectuals trained by Confucian philosophy. This means ancestor veneration, astrology, and a belief in personal example over formal rules, judgment over knowledge, virtue leading to shame, said to be superior to punishment by law. In theory, the emperor is subordinate to commoners, and unjust rulers may be overthrown if they lose the mandate of heaven. They would also bring Buddhism, with its emphasis on harmony and anti-materialism, which would fit better than Confucianism with most native beliefs. That doesn't mean no persecution of native traditions, though. Buddhist states, such as Myanmar, today harshly attack non-Buddhists. Finally, they'd also bring the idea of legalism, that you subdue people through laws, that you tie status entirely to service to the state, and you use censorship and informers. And they would also bring Taoism, this idea of government without exertion, action without action, with ideas ranging from anarchism to monarchy. The new food sources and wealth that the Americas bring back boost China's population and its economy even more. Ming Dynasty Chinese Empire has enough potential colonists to populate much of the Americas, unlike most of the previous examples we discussed. There's no reason the Chinese would not be as large a presence in the Americas as they are today in nations like Malaysia and Thailand, 15 to 25% of the entire population. Some Chinese would intermarry, while others choose to remain distinct, just as in Chinatowns in Asia and America today. There's also no reason the Chinese could not expand to take large parts of the Americas. At some point they meet the European invaders, perhaps by the Mississippi in North America, or the Pampas of Argentina and northern plains in Venezuela. Or if Zheng He's fleet first came to the Caribbean and Brazil, Latin America would be Chinese America, or Sino-America. War between Chinese native and mixed people and empire against Europeans would be much more equal than between other natives and Europeans. It's hard to say who would win. China would have a 70 to 150 year advantage in empire building, but China was crippled by European attacks in our timeline, parts of it colonized by half a dozen powers. Yet China came back. China for most of history has been the most powerful nation in the world. China today is a greater power economically, technologically than the US. It likely will be the future superpower since the US started declining at the start of the Iraq War. In our timeline, the Manchu dynasty took over from the Ming. The Manchus carried out genocide versus Dzungar people portrayed here. Possibly they could target natives as well. Manchus were followed by a failed republic, a fascist state under Chiang, and communism under Mao and others. Both Chiang and Mao killed tens of millions. Would the same happen to Chinese native colonies in America? Possibly, although it's hard to see why native states don't become independent in the 19th and 20th centuries, as the Americas became independent in our own time. Once Chinese native mixed societies become their own states, what kind of government would they have? It seems likely they would be indigenous democracy, since they are still 75 to 90% native. And that, compared to a 98% non-native US that exists today, certainly counts as native victory. This is the end of the 4th video. I look forward to your comments and questions and will answer them as often as I can. Racism, genocide denial, childish behavior, or personal attacks will get deleted. But I do recognize that some questions will be asked in ignorance because much of the facts I point to are news to most people. They were never taught about this. They've been raised in denial since denying indigenous genocides is taught in almost all public schools. Next time we will discuss what if Europe is conquered by a Muslim caliphate or the Mongol Empire, and how this would affect natives and the Americas. Please repost freely, like, share, comment. I will post again in about a week. This has been What If Natives Won video blog and channel.